Thank you, Amir, and the organizers for inviting me to give this lecture. So I'm Ahmed El Hadi. I'm a neuroscientist at Princeton University, and unfortunately, I couldn't come to the meeting because we know we live in times where borders are increasing between countries, between people. So we were promised in the global project or the project of globalism that we will all be one and all these delusions we have been promised. But now this project have been led bare into its reality, which is the reality we expected is one of constrained movement. So the other thing, you heard that I'm a neuroscientist. You might be wondering why a neuroscientist is talking at a Southern Aesthetics Conference. So you'll find me reading from the paper that I wrote the text in because, I forget stuff and I don't want to be to lose track of my ideas. So let me briefly introduce myself. So I am a son or a daughter or a being of the South. I grew up in its meshes and trenches in Egypt, though my subjectivity was constructed through what many would call a westernized education. I remained throughout my academic career as a neuroscientist, a hyper-focused, specialized scientist like the ones you meet almost every day on daily basis, till the 2011 uprisings happened in Egypt, which for me was a monumental event and for many others. Since then, among many other things, a transdisciplinary implosion happened to me, as if it was waiting to happen, triggered by the unfolding of the emancipatory events. Since 2011, me and many others were and still are faced by almost existential questions. There was this moment or event of awakening, and these existential questions are hunting us still today because the events of 2011 didn't end. We are still living it as it become more and more apparent that this was not this very restricted moment of 2011, but the unfolding of what happens next. These existential questions are: who are we as a subject of the South, as the oppressed subject, as the post-colonial subject, as the differentialized subject? Who are we as subjects? And what does resistance means for us within this framing of the colonized, the post-colonial, the Southern subject? What does resistance mean for us? So being from the South, I find myself, as I moved to the United States and also to the West, I used to live in Germany before the United States, I find myself interlocked into pre-existing structure. By this, I mean that I find myself defined most ridiculously by American academic circles who are telling me every day that I am this subaltern subject who cannot speak, who cannot express, who has to be locked in some authentic identity. So, but also being a nomadic scientist, I found myself dizzied by these questions of identity because as a scientist, I have all the time to cling to this notion of the rational universal. So, and also intensified on the especially American political level is this current climate of boxing yourself in a rigid box culture. And like colloquially or vulgarly called identity politics. So I decided to stop and ask, how do I, as a neuroscientist, perceive the human predicament within this complicated meshwork in its generality in the context of the evolving brain sciences. So my mind is trying to deal with all these conflicting identities, having been in the revolutionary moment in Egypt in 2011, where there were universal demands, but then being deterritorialized and moved to the West, where I am predefined as this subject who cannot talk. So how can I reconcile all this like conflicting feelings while observing this unfolding of popular unrests from Chile to Iraq to Syria to Rojava to Egypt to Lebanon and more to come, as if the world is telling us enough. as if the South is screaming, as if there is a universal collective tsunami yearning for something. There is no doubt that these uprisings are interconnected, and any analysis that only assumes locality will end up being delimited in and of itself. So in my talk today, I will take you on a journey, most probably a fragmented journey, because I like to jot down ideas here and there of what I define as a brain, answering the question of what is a brain, being a neuroscientist, tackling the level of subjectivity and the societal implications of this rapidly evolving brain sciences. Then I will move on to talk about the aesthetic experience, which is the subject of the conference, and how it relates to many notions of the brain. Then I will end with notes on resistance. So I would rather say not notes, as I said, there are fragments on resistance or fragmentary notes on resistance. As I always resist the prescriptive tendencies that come with this neoliberal planning and defined contours of what can look like a business plan in order to achieve resistance. So let me begin by defining some terminology and some of my theoretical commitments, which are very tied to the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze, who affected a lot my thinking in terms of thinking about neuroscience, the neural, and the brain. So the Deleuzian society, if one can call something like this, is built on a homogenized notion of subjectivity within the emerging neural culture. So let me unpack this sentence. So by neural culture, we mean the centralization of the being on a notion of the brain, which has in this respect replaced the soul, as if the brain displaced the soul as a token for a theological dimension that stretched infinitely into the existential horizon. Rather than resolving the philosophical overhang of mind-matter duality, the lack of critical evaluation of the conceptual basis of the notion of the brain collapses divergent discourses into a persuasive and amorphous belief system. To this end, the brain as a notion of cultural identification has metamorphosed through stages of confinement to the distributed fluidity. So the evolution of the perception of the brain as a notion, not only as an organ, has mirrored contemporary understanding and evolution of power relationships in the societies as a whole. So while the Foucauldian disciplinary society is represented by confinement, the Deleuzian society of control is represented by distributed fluidity. In Foucauldian disciplinary society, power is exerted within every disciplinary boundary, within the confined spaces represented by organized institutions, from the school to the hospital to the prison. In Deleuze's societies of control, on the other hand, subjects have become an ethereal homogeneous entity, subsidized by the capital and continuously engaged in a process of violent atomization. So the process of the emergence of the Deleuzian society of control, and this I would say it's a short but very penetrative essay, The Postscript on Society of Control. The emergence of the societies of controls involve massive deterritorialization invoked by nomadism and capitalist machinery coupled, and sustained by the extensive digital network from social media to smartphones to the Internet of Things. Networks of control can only be sustained through what? How can the networks of control be sustained? Through the antagonism of perpetual atomization and the concurrent and induction of false individuality. While I am becoming an atom like all other atoms, I have the false sense of individuality. The atomic individual internalizes the dynamic fluidity of a confined system that is a priori controlled. And the network of control exerts its own control not through the medium of institutionally embodied power, but is distributed in the self-policing of the individuated members, where the individual becomes dividual, which are mutants of the individuals. This controlled fluidity is a rigidity only apparently fluid. Just to be clear, it is a controlled system. In vulgar terms, it is a controlled system that appear fluid, that appear flexible, that appear changeable, while being rigid at its core. Unlike the institutions, whose rigidity is obvious and promotes resistance, this process of constructing assumed subjectivity is pervasive, in that its subjects not only remain unaware that they are being constructed through this network of control, but actively involved in what can be called a process of subjective subjectivelessness or degradative subjectivity. So here we will begin to move into the path of desubjectification, which is a very crucial point in induction of control in the societies of control. So the path of desubjectification is crucial for a rooted understanding of the totality of control. The contextualization of the process of desubjectification is one of becoming a non-subject. So what is the non-subject? A non-subject is in a continuous antagonism with a desubjectified subject that is a subject. Might be a complicated formulation, but what I want to say is that it becomes apparent that the non-subject subject becomes a fundamentally false dichotomy, but it is rather the non-subject, desubjectified subject is this dialectical notions that basically emerges within this society of control. So in order to realize the desubjectification as a process, the non-subject should be invoked as a fundamental category. Thus, in our frame of context, the non-subject is the subject. The interchangeability of the subject and non-subject invokes a confusion crucial for shifting contextualization in a rhizomatic manner. Whilst engaged in the generation of their own individuality, non-subjects becomes homogeneous, producing selected mutants, apparently different but internally similar. So all what I'm trying to say here within the theoretical jargon is this is a mechanism by which subjects are violently desubjectified, but not totally desubjectified. They become non-subject, okay? This non-subject is devoid of its own subjectivity, and there is an imposed or an internalized subjectivity that is basically apparently look different, but at its very core is one governed by the totality of the networks of control. So this produces this what can be seen as a contradictory form of having different subjects on the apparent form level, but at the core is that there is this mechanism of control that homogenizes them. And it will become clearer and clearer as we move on. This again reveals the antagonistic dichotomy as an ontological presupposition for sustained control. So I cannot have the control obvious by having all the subjects apparently similar. Okay, they have to be apparently different at core similar, so that the control can be passed like a germ like a viral vector without being seen, without being detected, which is very important in the post-disciplinary societies. It produces a new type of policing that is internalized, diminishing the possibility of breaking free from techno-capitalist machinery. Because the policing appears self-generated, and thus autonomous for the individuals. It allows ideological censorship to pass unquestioned once the subjects are sufficiently homogenized. This homogenization arises as a direct consequence of individualization, again, as favored by current capitalist society. So we have atom individualization producing atoms that maybe at the surface look different, but at the core they are the same. They internalized policing, so they apparently have the behavior that will be in accordance with the policing without having this external policing, which is a very, very dark view. The atomization of the individual creates them on the psychic level a narcissistic enclosure. So at its very extreme, this enclosure is a self-realization of hedonistic subjectivity within the web of capitalist exploitation, which is by necessity a delusional experience. Hedonistic self-realization requires external validation as its reward, as if it relates to this big other there, making the process dependent on an externality of techno-digital web that desubjectivizes the individual, making it the object of the presumed gaze of the others, which may or may not exist in a sphere where audiences only exist in an abstract virtual reality, which put an extensive notion of atomization and individuation, because here even the others, even the gaze of the other, exist on an abstract virtual reality. So the non-subject subject. I like to confuse here the terms. The non-subject subject therefore becomes a desubjectified yet externally self-realized zombie. So we talked about the internal processes, but externally what I see is this self-realized zombie. I use the word zombie here. So what is this externally self-realized zombie? So this non-subject now becomes the self-realized zombie. So what is the self-realized zombie? So this is a creature that in actuating its own perceived demands and impulses become part of a homogenized violent mass. So the term zombie precisely encapsulates the extensive desubjectification mediated through the interconnected web of individuals, controlled through infused commodifications of what appears shared and common between the individuals. So here the process of desubjectification is going out of this first, the techno-digital web, the capitalist societies, even through the shared and common. Desubjectification through the common. The common, as an example, this charity, this philanthropy, even the common takes part in this violent process of desubjectification. This commodification of the common turns communal processes yet again into capitalist exchanges, themselves easily controlled and homogeneous. The subject engaging in those exchanges, from what they assume to be their own desires, which is a very, very loaded term, they assume it to be their own desires, become itself a commodity, desubjectified and zombified by the external bombardment of media, inciting and controlling the desires that the individuals perceive to be their own. So even the desire to desire become an externally controlled commodity. So, and this is what I can call this psycho-neuro-totalitarian control, that the control doesn't only affect the individual and keeps the individual even aware of the control, but it controls the psychic level that the sense that you are being controlled doesn't even exist. So the notion of the common is thus appropriated by the individualist capitalist machinery. Therefore, it is this deliberate flattening of the common into a one-dimensional stratum of commodities by which the extensive socio-political enclosure in postmodern societies are created, mediated by the actively participating subjects. So here I'm not talking about a dark society where everybody is a zombie walking. No, we are all walking alive and happy and interaction, but at the end, it is this: we are all zombies. We are all zombies. It is this system of control of socio-political inclusion mediated by very actively participating subjects, auto-policing their existence in accordance with their perceived desire for self-realization, which is dictated by the techno-capitalist machinery. So, during pre-modern and modern capitalism, so maybe this is an arbitrary historical thing where I want to say that we are now in this like postmodern form of capitalism, is confinement was during the pre-modern and modern capitalism, confinement was the essential machinery for societal control. But its visibility made resistance possible. I see who is the enemy, who is out there, who to resist against. In contrast, a deconfined machinery, exploiting the communal and allowing individuals a misbelief in their own subjectivity, finds itself invisible in these postmodern times, if we can say it is like this. The thus created enclosures are by far more pervasive than their predecessors. These pervasive enclosures are totalities in the sense that society in its very construction becomes a meshwork of hierarchical enclosure, enclosure inside an enclosure, inside an enclosure, and the hierarchy of enclosure. Unlike preceding institutional confinement, that sense represented in architectural spaces, because they exist. There was a wall. I passed from the hospital to the school to the prison, but now this space is opened up in an extensively deterritorialized manner. Were limited in the reach, the disciplinary spaces, so one can, do some rebellion. Can rebel because I know where maybe the disciplinary boundary is. But now it becomes this boundless. So as if, one can say that this is like a disciplinary wall, but what happened is that there is this opening and flattening, that it becomes a whole surface moving and undulating all around. So I cannot really pinpoint where exactly the attack should happen, where exactly resistance can happen. So, and this is why enclosure in the postmodern society of control are circulatory in nature. So, what does this mean? Like it suggests a circular causality that denies subjectivity and authorship, because it becomes this sustained Uber system that does not even, because we have become non-subjects, it does not even depend on the subject. So there is this abstract Uber level of circular causalities that basically denies subjectivity and authorship, and instead reiterates and reaffirms the multiple realization of essentially homogeneous categories. So I'm here taking it to another level, that it's not only the non-subject who becomes a subject, it's that the categories of thinking become so homogeneous and so tautological by these enclosures that even on the abstract thinking level, there is a transcendental limit that is being imposed there by this extensive enclosure. So the circular enclosures The circular enclosures grow to spheres of individuation. Enclosure with enclosures, they grow together into a sphere of individuation, with defragmentation non-coincidental but essential to the process. So also this fragmentation of enclosure is a whole other layer of necessity to maintain the control by ensuring that these enclosures are unbreakable to those non-subjects who are being turned zombies within this narcissistic enclosure. So postmodern social construction is spherical individuation, is this spheres of individualization that we talked about, that becomes insurmountable insofar as the sphere is invisible, beyond the assumed, and also the spherical existence of other atomized individuals. So it becomes this big blob sphere in which non-subjects are embedded, thinking they are subjects, while an external observer would think they are a total zombies or even some kind of a flow atoms that all look the same, maybe with some vibratory changes, but at the end, one doesn't matter. So contemporary postmodern capitalist dynamics of enclosures, like I detailed it theoretically before, rest on a notion of the brain. Okay, because let me take the vulgar definition that the subjectivity is basically embedded or somehow controlled by the brain. So this contemporary postmodern capitalist dynamics of enclosures, as detailed above, rest on a notion of the brain that is rational, regarding it as a rationalized seat of the soul post-enlightenment. So I'm going back to this point that the brain have displaced the soul post-enlightenment. The brain in this reading is defined as an inherently rational machine, universal to all human beings, but yet again, in an anthropomorphic sense, denied to non-human categories. I will not tackle in this talk the whole ecological repercussions of a brain in non-human categories. So in collapsing mind and body dualities in a poorly delineated concept, it has thus increasingly become an invasively Orwellian term. The brain have become an Orwellian term. Itself empty, it can be filled with meaning and pre-existing notions of control. So it becomes one of these enclosures we talked about before that basically are empty but exert control. Universal subjectivity is one such notion of control that is disguised as empirical scientific endeavor. So delineating the common universals between autonomously acting subjects. And just a small detour. By universality here, I feel that I need to clarify that this is the Western notion of universality, contextualized within a Western context. So in this, it defines being itself in and of itself a universality. So the declared aim of cognitive neuroscience, which is an area of active research, is to study the neural basis of cognition, becomes thus to discover the universal cognitive modalities that define what a brain is, and thus fully characterize and hence desubjectifies human reality. Why desubjectify it? Because, okay, if we can fully describe it using these rational agents, we can do away with the human as such. This is sure shocking to hear from a scientist, I can imagine, but there is more to come. So this becomes a circular argument. Enlightenment has removed theological connotations of the soul and banned subjects into the enclosures of their own embodied autonomy, leaving the brain to satisfy the need both for explanation and belief, for understanding and wonder. And this is where the moment where we think of science as theology, of scientific belief as theological commitment. And this is important to say here. Yet the definition of what a brain is with how it is affected by the social reality is largely untackled. And it did not break free from this connotation of science as a theological commitment. So left to the realm of science alone, and here what I mean by science is this science as some kind of a theological commitment. The problem has been seemingly addressed in different disciplines without having its own theory, or rather its own meta-theory. So a philosophy of the brain would concern itself with the fundamental ontological construction of the abstract necessary defining characteristic of the brain. So I need to ask, if I ask someone what is a brain, it's a difficult question. It's not just the organs that we have here in our head. So what is a brain? So in contrast to the philosophy of mind, I'm sure you have heard of the philosophy of mind that investigates that mind. I don't know what mind is. Don't ask me. And is, in our opinion, unavoidably dualistic within the Cartesian frame. So this is again some kind of sometimes a very vulgar or naive theological commitments to this duality of the mind and brain. A philosophy of brain, in my opinion, is more fundamental a bit, because it should concern itself with defining what a brain is without presupposing a duality and presenting some kind of materialist understanding of what a brain is within the complex mesh of social reality, which ring a bell of, okay, what will be a Marxist redefinition of the brain, or brains. So because I don't want to contradict myself, I cannot just say we defy the homogenized notions and then I say what is a brain? What are brains? What is brains with us? So while cognitive sciences have dealt with this to some extent, they have been largely dominated by computationalist, rationalist assumptions, the naive version of them. As tense, I'm critiquing here. So, building models of the brain based solely on theories of the abstract, rational, and universal computation is restrictive and necessarily disempowering, and have an implicit political commitment. For its absolute and apparently resolved objectivity reinforces narrative of the brain that are indistinguishable from those of the individual soul pre-enlightenment. And here my very fundamental critique of that the undividable soul pre-enlightenment becomes the brain, which is also undividable universal after post-enlightenment. This limits both the value of empirical neuroscience based on these models and the wider societal engagement with assumptions underpinning our current understanding of the brain. So a reformulation of the brain as an entity beyond computationalist, rationalist assumption is as crucial for a viable critical theory of neuroscience. So if I am complaining about neuroscience in the practical sense, being militarized, being used in a heavily capitalist sense. There is nothing more popular now than neurotechnologies and a boom in corporation investing in neuroscience, is that if I want to develop a critical theory of neuroscience, I don't need just to criticize applications, but I want to go into the source of the fundamental problems there, which is the definition of what a brain is. The subject matter. So one important consequence of the computationalist rationalist view of the brain is that it is permissive of control. It permits control. So providing the foundation of the pervasive desubjectification processes that we talked about. So now we have a substrate by which all these processes of desubjectification we talked about happen, that we have alluded to already. So a partial permutation of collective enunciative assemblage
The machinic unconscious defined briefly as the situationing of the unconscious in a societal and spatial temporality dominated by the machinization and the deterritorialized enunciations rendered senseless by the extensivity of postmodern capitalism. So the notion of universal cognitive modalities intensifies the process of annihilation of the machinic unconscious, and a Deleuzian notion here, a very important Deleuzian notion, is replacing its potential for the emergence of subjectivity with the homogeneity of universal rationality. Penetrating the subject with psychoanalytic means becomes practically and even theoretically impossible. The intensive desubjectification that denies even its unconscious, leaving the question as to whether the unconscious can be fully controlled. Those faculties that cannot be controlled do not exist. This is the motto of what a brain is within postmodern capitalism. A very important lesson is this. The unconscious is masked, censored by contemporary neuroscientific views due to its untenability and the mere difficulty of its control. Psychoanalytic theories are rendered mystical by capitalist productive machinery, or it is turned to an evidence-based psychoanalysis that denies imagination or displaces its functionality. So censorship of the unconscious as the mainstream rhetoric reiterates the fact that the capitalist machinery of control actively engages in its domination by this conceptual notion of the brain as a control machine. An Orwellian construction of language is necessary to provide the media for the inversion of the meaning of the previously benign notions. And this is a general thing about linguistic control. Linguistic control is the prime medium of ontological imprisonment. So for me to redefine the brain, I have to first realize that there are these tools of linguistic control that are the prime medium for ontological imprisonment. So Deleuze has alluded to the language as fundamentally non-essential and non-universal, but rather a medium for the schizoanalytic positioning of interacting with capitalism through a chiasm of overlapping antagonism of the delusion and the irreal. So we have the delusional, we have the irreal, we have the surreal, and the non-real are permutating fluidic notions of a partial emerging subjectification, allowing an imposition of the imaginary in the future, opening up the oppressive nature of language to destructuralization. So all this jargon that I mentioned is just putting the foundation for a project for destructuralization of language as non-essential, as non-universal, as even astructural. The future here is not just a temporality, but also a dimensional spatiality. Future in space, not only in time. Emerging within the dimensionless space of linguistic structural penetrability. Constraints through language becomes a final closure. This is the real final closure. An ontological closure that constrains the spherical, invisible density of the individual, as such imprisoned in and of themselves. The finality here is not a teleological framing for a centralized control, but rather a fluidic finality that is not final in itself. Because to believe in its own finality means we are dead, we are done, we cannot even exist. So the issue is that even with this fluidic finality, it is not in itself final. So the exogenous finality is the one perpetuated by a rigidity of capitalist colonization, but the endogenous rhizomatic definalization antagonize its finality. So here there is this hope that the fluidic nature inside will be the way for the definalization that can antagonize the final nature of these constraints. Up to this point, we have considered how the current notion of the brain is defined by the capitalist terminological totalization, which refers to the specific linguistic terms that we have been appropriated by capitalism as ontologically inherent to the natural order. So another thing is this definitions that are being said as pertaining to the natural order as Platonic. So the brain in this terminological sense is considered to be the central source for enclosures from the societal to the ontological. If we take the definition, the contemporary definition of the machine of control, which is the brain as such. From a conceptual framework of the brain, one arrives at the notion of the neuron, which neural, you know that the brain have neurons inside. So there is this notion of the neural, constitutive of the brain. So one taken to its limit, there are this, if the brain is this machine of control that basically constructs or this sphere of individuation, this spheres of control. So at the end, taken to its limit, it constructs what we call neural cultures, as if culture is neural in and of itself, can be reduced to groups of neurons, to groups of brains, which is equating to groups of subjects, or as we said before, groups of non-subjects. From Deleuze's critical analysis of cultural production, so these neural cultures can be defined as dynamic and self-individuating, actively involved in the genesis of experience, rather than resigned to mere spectatorship. So here our hope is in this rhizomatic, emergence, because even if there are these spheres of individuation, even controlled by those neurons and brains, but the moment they interact, there is this possibility of a rhizomatic structure. So the spectacular nature is that of a dissociation where the subject is transformed into a commodity. So as we all know, in the society of the spectacle, Guy Debord presents a strong case that extensive capitalism leads to commodities relating to each other as spectacles, supervening the subjects from which the commodified self have emerged. The spectacular framing splits existence into object, subject, and commodity, where the three ontological categories within this framing are basically superimposed into the exploitative nature of the capital, with the apparent distinction and commodities assuming the hegemonic category of capital. So why I'm bringing here the spectacle, because the spectacular nature is basically what we are experiencing as such within postmodern capitalism. But then when Deleuze tried to redefine neural culture as a frame of cultural production that goes beyond this staticity and the terminological totalization and the spectacularity inherent to modern conception of the thinking machine, which is the brain. I say thinking machine, I say the brain, artificial intelligence, all of them for us naively on a cultural level gives the same connotation. Also, claims of dynamism are made that if we understand the brain, there will be this cultural openings. So I am very pessimistic that if we go on with how brain is conceived in postmodern capitalism, we are doomed, and this will be the apocalyptic end. The postmodern dynamism remains a confined distribution, again, and does not become an unbounded fluidity. Again, this mirrors this apparent fluidity that happens at the subject level that we talked about, but now it's on the cultural emergent level. Thus, the postmodern dynamism is considered essentially static, reflecting a non-invertible perceptuality of an integral status quo that remains always consistent. So it is maintaining the status quo of capitalism through some apparent fluidity in order not to invoke instabilities or potential disturbances. The ideological endeavor of machinization is that of commodification of control. By viewing the totality of life as a machine, Brains are inevitably the epitome of intelligent machines. Viewing the brain as a computer is a logical corollary, even though philosophers have tried to highlight that the notion of computation within neurosciences has some specific differences to the term used in computer science. It appears obvious for us that away from formalism, which I am not going to discuss here, the underlying definitions and formalizations of the problem are always that of control, as if our mind is being socialized. Sorry, I'm used here mind, but our subjectivities are being socialized in terms of control. This is the ideology of control. This reflects again the fact that the linguistic channels cannot escape at all the large infusive strata of the society of control, which Deleuze have warned us about. We cannot claim here to be breaking out of the, as Ahmed, I'm not claiming here that I am breaking out of the linguistic imprisonment and its totalitarian control. Rather, we are trying, me and others are trying to create a non-place. So what is the non-place? Non-place can be seen in also an aesthetic sense. So a non-place was coined first as a term describing supermodern urbanization, but here we refer to it in a way that illustrates a transient autonomous zone, where posing restrictive linguistic reality. Oh, is it possible to have a non-place? A non-place can be compared to a vacuum, but unlike the vacuum, it has some content, making it some quasi-vacuum, a state of matter and or existence that is intermediary and fluid. Reaching the non-place, or even looking at its surface or horizon, can be regarded as a psychotic experience that shows us potential alternative, as if I need to be in a state of trance in order to break off the linguistic imprisonment of the postmodern societies of control. This non-place is a hallucinatory experience. I am not here advocating for psychedelic, but this is something on the same line, that maybe we need the psychedelic experience to break free of the constraints of the place into the non-place. So this non-place is a hallucinatory experience that dissociated itself from the society of control, which we consider as a mental illness by many. In its anti-psychiatry placement, the non-place opens us up to a new plethora of realities that first and above all try to escape the capitalist exploitation. So this is a merely aesthetic experience, just to say. But maybe it's a psychedelic aesthetic experience. We have to admit that the creation of those autonomous zones within the totalitarian meshwork of the state and the capital is very difficult, almost impossible. We foresee that the construction of the Deleuzian conception of the neuron will only emerge in this very non-place. The induction of terminological confusion is the perturbatory activity of the artistic equivalency to the brain as a fluidic heterogeneity. So I defined the brain as this notion of fluidic heterogeneity. A slowly terminological confusion is a hallucinatory circularity of psychosis, but a terminological confusion dialectically morphing and demorphing from the structural terminological hegemony is the hallucinatory non-place linguistic mediation. So in a postmodern society, nothing escapes terminological confusion in a concentric circles of abstraction dominating a strata of stability. Retrospectively, the assertion that nothing escapes is a legitimized claim. So nothing escapes coding, machinization, commodification, perturbation, reproduction, and expansion that provide the fluidic medium for capitalist control, going deeply into the biopolitical oppression of individual of biomimetic machines. The mimesis is the homogenization by reproducing the controlled dynamics of the basic biological replication from coding to translation. The escapade is thus to the decapitalization. Our proposed decapitalization is through this non-place. So attempting a Deleuzian redefinition from this non-place is not limited to the original definition from a theory of cultural production, but conversely could mean a radical change of our understanding of the neural, and could emerge as one of the very first contribution to an actual critical theory of the brain. A contribution is not to be felt as the capitalist sense of achievement, but as a natural emergence of the non-place without this notion of the individual capitalist achiever who makes significant contribution. In a non-place, there is no contribution. So the dynamism inherent in the Deleuzian reading of the neuron would have critical effects on our understanding of neuroscience as a whole, as it will shift its conceptual framework and by necessity its epistemological frame. As illustrated above, cognitive sciences operate from a paradigm of undividable computational axioms that in their universality they seek a reflection in neural representations. Classically, this has always been understood to be anatomical. Starting in the dark historical trenches of phrenology, we have not moved on far, passing through the fascist Nazi project. We have not moved afar, focusing still on the separation of brain areas that represent neural processes and have specific functions. We have progressed from lesional studies to structural and functional imaging, and now apply the same theoretical non-framework. Because I don't want to give it a legitimacy, it is a non-framework on a larger matrix of data points by looking at networks and connectivity as yet another reflection of the indivisible universal cognitive modules. On the other extreme of the spectrum, building blocks for neural function are literally atomized. From gross anatomical areas to neural subgroups to synapses to transmitter to genes, one finds ever smaller categories that correlate to aberrations from the universal cognitive normality in medical neuroscience. Whilst all approaches have left us with more data than before, as a combined effort, neuroscience and its anatomical presupposition now face the problem of becoming exponentially data rich, but crushingly remain theory poor. Even though it is theoretically poor, but in the current conception of neuroscience, theories would be thought of in a formal inherent to the analytical tradition that stems from the ideology of control. So the need is not for a theory within the current conceptualization of the brain, but for a meta-theory that encompasses a shifting of the neuroscience conceptual frame. Here it appears relevant to evoke or invoke the Deleuzian notion or conception of the outside, as seen in the distributed networks of control. Deleuze does away with requiring the external, omnipotent institution to illustrate a network of totalitarian control. This control is distributed and pervasive and relies on the interaction between its perceived objects. Forces for Deleuze only exist in their plural, necessarily in the fluidic assemblage conceived as a dynamic force. Similarly, the neuroanatomical notion of the brain as a whole complete structures that ought to be understood by investigating its atomic constituents only is to be met with doubt that it is an obviously flawed project. A neuroanatomy reflective of the dynamism of a Deleuzian neuroscience would have to do away with the externality of the world outside the anatomical brain. This more radically would make environmentally induced changes. Listen to here, this is the trying to redefine what a brain is. This more radically would make environmentally induced changes in neuronal morphology and function, not noise, but the very essence of what a critical neuroanatomy becomes the detailed understanding of the dynamic fluidity of this Deleuzian neural process, just to say, that can be distributed within brain areas, between brain areas, and external influences, importantly involves the neural substrate of interactability, thus making the societal as a whole neural, not confined to the biological organ, which is the brain. Instead of delineating demarcations of perceived and always deceptive anatomical borders, it would trace the relationships between neural instances establishing the brain as an assemblage that include. So here, if you haven't paid attention to all what I said before, trying to like really motivate the redefinition of the brain. So just to listen to this definition, which is very important, brain as an assemblage that includes the totality of processes accessible and non-accessible to the narrow current experimental investigation. Taken further, this reading necessarily alludes that rather than a product of abstract reflection and cognition, the brain is an immersed object in its own subjective reality, as a subjectless subject, both product and creator at the same time in a closed loop fashion, as if the brain has a subjectivity in and of itself. The artificial split between objective reality and the subject is a contemporary predicament, which can be seen as a modern, postmodern mosaic. It is worth to note here that our use of modernity and postmodernity might be arbitrary, meaning that we do not want to tie ourselves to the hegemony and non-fluidity of rigid historical events, because history was never linear. Mixing modernity and postmodernity produces a confusion that is reflective of the ahistoricity of societies of control, because it deletes the history and infuses the here and now into its atomized individuals, because the ahistoricity is the beginning of and part essential of control. The scientific establishment has made a pragmatic demarcation that we did not stay confined within, but taken this distinction, this demarcation of the subject and object, taken to its extreme, have become ideological, and as a science becomes a theology. Although the interdependencies and the indistinguishabilities are ubiquitous in the fabric of reality, the split of the object-subject still persists, indicates a very pervasive and important ideological function. Within the Deleuzian frame, there is no split, and everything is a subject and object in and of itself. The brain is a subjectless subject immersed in a fluidic reality, where the subjectlessness is a dimensionless existence, with the dimensionality confused by the fluidic deterritorization of constructs within these interdependencies that are inevitable looping relation. By necessity, all sets of possible relations are included within these fluidic constructions of interdependencies and indistinguishabilities. Any attempt to cut through the construction hides if I try to cut through this construction, which is the brain as an assemblage, hides interdependencies, as the cut induces a fragmentation that seems to be sensitive to intervention from within, and it cannot interfered with from any externality. It is impossible to cut through without losing the totality of it. The non-place defined beforehand might be a way to interact with this fluidic construction. The non-place as a fluidic autonomy might dynamically interact with another fluidic autonomy, forming a channel or channels that transiently reveal the landscape of relations without collapsing to a one-dimensional interaction akin to what the atomized external interaction does. In a world view of indistinguishability, one can see art and the associated aesthetic experience as a counter-scientific culture that is not non-scientific in nature, but rather scientific in an anarchic alternative sense, where the artist, and I want, if you again don't pay attention to all the theoretical jargon, I said that in this sense, art and the associated aesthetic experience can become an alternative counterculture that is not that is scientific but in an anarchic sense, where the artist and scientist becomes interchangeable, within a non-splitting relation of object-subject, in the non-place. I like this notion, this spatial notion of the non-place. Within cultural production, within this non-place, the artist that actuates the subversive and luminal quality of the brain. In the production of artwork, the artist is both its creator and its spectator and the scientist of the brain. The artwork is not a separate, isolated, de-innervated object, but it is highly innervated and made alive by its dynamic relationship with the art, as if there is a loop between the artist and the art, forming and reforming those brains. So the artist and their works are in an iterative looping of interactivity, naturally bypassing this object-subject split that then becomes a continuum. The categorical framing of the brain is thus shifted to that of an assemblage. Again, the brain is an assemblage, as we alluded beforehand. The assemblage in this sense, and in the Deleuzian one, as many of you might know, is a coarse-grained description underlined by an infinite continuum of sequentialities completely indistinguishable. So the brain, instead of being this let's say it's like a group of wires together in which there is some algorithm of control, it becomes this infinity. Let's say it becomes this like tube or form, amorphous form, that have what I call sequentialities, like slice after slice after slice that form this amorphous subject. So this is an infinite continuum of sequentialities, completely indistinguishable. We therefore define sequentialities as transient states of interaction in an extended temporal order within the assemblage realization of the brain. So this is like an assemblage within the assemblage, what we call maybe micro-assemblage, and can also be regarded as microstate description of the assemblage, to borrow notions from physics. So it just complements the fluidic assemblages and offer an underlying mechanistic fluidization process for the emergence of temporality and spatiality. Sequentialities, this notion that I defined, is thus a notion that allows mapping the work of art onto the work of the brain. So the brain and the art become one. And into a more general terms, mapping the fluidities of interacting assemblages onto each other, revealing the channels of landscapes of relations. The artwork emerging of the dynamic fluidity of the artist and its work reflects the organizing principles of the brain in the Deleuzian sense that we laid the foundation for beforehand. Thus, the neuroaesthetic brain is in phase the brain in and of itself. So it's in fact the brain is this neuroaesthetic brain. Here we use the term neuroaesthetic. You might have heard about this very naive area of research called neuroaesthetics, where the neuroscientists try to pin down one or two brain areas, or the brain area responsible for the perception of some paintings, of some aesthetic experience, thus vulgarizing the aesthetic experience or trying to control it again within this capitalist notion of even killing the frontiers of aesthetic experience. We find the aforementioned definition of this neuroaesthetics I talked about counter-revolutionary and follows within the web of control, as it neglects the fundamental character of the brain as immersed in a dynamic fluid relation with the art. We argue that this field of neuroaesthetics will be revolutionized by our redefinition of the brain as such, because in our sense the artwork become in itself a subject and an integral part of the endless becoming looping with the brain in an indistinguishable manner. Engaging in artistic practice in non-place, not anywhere. It's in this non-place we talked about. is in fact accessing and acknowledging a word information in terms of sequentialities. The word is not a static word, but it is a word information in terms of the sequentialities. Being an artist is the embodiment of the brain that the neural cultures are built on. Sequentialities, again, I go back to this notion that I came up with, are those microstates that are break apart from the rigidity of the constrained assemblage to unconstrained one. The artistic setting then becomes the inducer of the unconstraining sequentialities, opening up the possibilities that we foresee as the foundation of the emergence and the dynamicity of the non-place, and also the shifting conceptual framework of neuroscience. That the project of neuroscience, in my own sense, then critical neuroscience, becomes that of an artistic unleashing of the dynamic equivalency of the brain with the art, and breaking free from the dominant frame of the rational machine. Is that all at the end? So is it all at the end? All this academic jargon that I throw away trying to redefine the brain. Where does the Southern aesthetics fit here? I mean, it's a conference of Southern aesthetics. So Southern aesthetics for me, as Ahmed, is the Southern resistance. So within the global South, resistance have been confined in many instances, and I'm already over my time. Has been confined in many instances to those reactionary strains of politics, one that tries to reconstitute an authentic future self from an imagined fragmented past. This project, which is I naively would call the post-colonial project, sets itself to heal the South from wounds of colonialism. It lately has nevertheless mirrored the logic of the colonial by bearing us, me, access to the universal. For me, then, in order to exist this deadlock, a universality emanating from the externalities, aka from those who have been perpetually excluded, will be the way forward for a futurity that is neither hegemonized by the North or controlled by the retroactive dominance of past demons. Southern aesthetic is history fictionized. So again, Southern aesthetics is history fictionized, evolved, and devolved to restructure the Southern subject as the neo-universal. Southern aesthetics is the expressivity of such a project of universalism without the universal conventionally construed as white, non-accessible. To this end, we cannot proceed to a future in which capitalism is halted without a counter-hegemonic project that is grounded in aesthetics as a revolutionary practice and existence, as a way of imagining and accelerating to the future. A future in which both the couple of the capital and the theological, not to forget about it, that have been both declared undead should be dead. Sounds impossible, maybe, but the aesthetics is the domain of the impossible. Thank you a lot for having me. Goodbye.